Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob DeGose. I'm one of two deputy city managers with the city of Palo Alto, and I've been asked to help to facilitate this meeting with a number of my colleagues. Welcome to the Palo Alto Arts Center. How many of you have been to the Palo Alto Arts Center before? Yes, it's a great place. The Palo Alto Arts Center is your place to see, make, and be inspired because everyone is an artist. Karen Kinzel, the Arts Center director, told me to let you know about that, so do come back and visit. Let me introduce a couple of people on our team here. We have City Manager Jim Keene here. We have Ed Shikata. He's Assistant City Manager, and actually I'm going to ask these two individuals to introduce themselves because I don't know their full names.
My name's Derek. Sorry, that was a wee bit loud. My name's Derek Penrice. I'm a consultant with Mott MacDonald. I'm a Vice President and Tunnels Practice Lead for the Western United States, and I've been designing and building tunnels for just about 30 years.
Good evening. My name is Mark Christoffels. I'm an Executive Director and Chief Engineer for the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, and I'll be doing a presentation on a trench project we built in the city of San Gabriel near LA that is similar to what you're contemplating tonight.
Well, thank you for being here. So I'm curious, people in the room, how many of you is this the first public meeting you've come to with respect to grade separation, this big issue of grade separation? So quite a few newcomers. Thank you for getting engaged and helping us with this very, very important decision. How many of you feel like you really understand the problem that we're trying to solve for? Pretty good number, okay. And how many of you are already really engaged and are providing the city staff with your input and your feedback on a regular basis on this topic? So we got a few regulars here. I see Nadia. Okay, great. Well, I think this meeting is going to be very informative for all of you. I just appreciate you coming. The purpose and objectives of the meeting this evening, there's a number of objectives. Primarily, we want to create awareness of the recent trench and tunnel white paper that we'll be talking about tonight. We want to share some perspectives that we have on the trench and tunnel ideas. We want to provide a perspective on what it takes to build a tunnel. And that's why we have our guest Mark here to share that experience. And probably most important is we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think, what you'd like the city to know. And we will summarize what we hear from you all this evening for the City Council and the Rail Committee that is primarily responsible for helping us come to a decision on a preferred solution for grade separation. So last thing I'll say before I just go over the agenda is I'd like to ask everyone that they're respectful throughout the meeting this evening, respect the presenters and one another. And I say this because I know that grade separation is extremely important to the entire community. And the stakes, as you all know, are really very high. And so naturally there can be some tension. So I ask everyone to please listen and hear one another, and let's have a productive time together. We have 2 hours. The first hour is really about setting context. We'll be sharing where we are now and where we need to go. We'll summarize the trench and tunnel white paper, and we'll have the assistance of Assistant City Manager Ed Shikata to do that. And then we'll have Mark come up and share his experience with the Alameda Corridor East Construction Authority and the large project they built that included a trench. Then we'll have some time for Q&A as a large group with all of us. And in the second half of the meeting, we're going to ask you to talk with a staff. We have a staff member at each of your tables, sort of a host. We're going to ask residents to talk to one another about what you heard, what questions you still have, what you think the city should know, and then we'll be capturing all of that information. We have several questions to help with that, and that's on the back of the program, and you can see that as we go through the evening. So that's the plan. Thank you all for coming. With that, I'd like to invite Ed Shikata to join me here.
Actually, I won't need that. So let's see if I can get this to work. That sounds like it's working. If so, let me ask Dave Lyons to raise your hand. actually got a little prize for you. We hadn't anticipated a door prize, but just that'll be an inside joke. You can ask him about it after the meeting. Okay, now that all eyes are on Dave, he dropped something. He was just returning it to its proper owner. So we thought about making it a door prize, but decided that best not be the case. Okay, so I am going to give you an executive briefing on the trench and tunneling white paper. So the first question, most important, perhaps to set some context for any type of briefing. How many folks in the room have actually had the opportunity to review the trench and tunneling white paper? Okay, a decent number. At the same time, part of our goal here is to provide information to everyone. So I will do a relatively brisk walkthrough. At the same time, the slides that I'll be using are available on the table. So we'll use them as a resource for more detailed discussion should there be questions. We will have a little opportunity for some Q&A to the extent that that's useful to the group as a whole. But nonetheless, I will go through this fairly quickly. Okay, in terms of some context, City Council has had its annual retreat, and in fact, we have actually a few council members here with us this evening. Among the priorities that the City Council established for us for the calendar year is to get to a preferred solution, a locally preferred alternative for how to tackle the challenge of rail grade separations by the end of this calendar year. So it's described here as our mission for 2018 that will go from what has currently been compiled and categorized to in general terms, 40 ideas of what could be done at the 4 at-grade crossings that we've got here in Palo Alto, to 4 to 8 specific alternatives that could be studied in more detail beyond, again, sort of a preliminary review, and then to get to a preferred solution. So let me speak to the particulars of the problem we're trying to solve, and I know that many identified or raised your hands as having a good handle on it, but perhaps just for the sake of recap here. Caltrain modernization, known as electrification, for those who are familiar with the work that Caltrain is doing to go from the diesel-powered trains to electric trains, overhead power systems and the like, is underway and in fact is under construction. There are foundations that are being laid in the north part of the corridor, and that project is proceeding on course after a little bit of hiccup with federal funding last year, but that are actually a year or so ago, and that is now proceeding very quickly. So as a consequence, or as part of the service, and this is an important service that Caltrain provides for the economy of the peninsula from San Francisco to San Jose down into the valley, that this could increase significantly the number of trains that are proceeding through Palo Alto. That over the course of the next roughly 8 years or so, that there could be 20 trains per hour passing through, more than doubling the number that are currently traveling through Palo Alto. And as a result, that if nothing is done, that the gates continue to be the method through which trains are given priority at crossings, gates could be down roughly 25% of the time, or 45 seconds out of every 3 minutes during the peak periods, and that this could cause a doubling of our traffic congestion in addition to the safety and access concerns and constraints presented by those at-grade crossings. In addition, these 40 ideas, or in order to address this issue, we really need to take these 40 ideas to more specific concepts and alternatives that can be engineered and evaluated in more detail so we can answer questions of what does this mean in terms of access, what does it mean in terms of properties that would need to be really evaluated in detail in order to answer those questions. There's an order of magnitude estimate of about $200,000 to $300,000 per alternative for us to evaluate in detail. For that reason, we really do need to get from these 40 broad ideas to a very specific set of alternatives that can be evaluated in detail. And just a final note here that many of you may be aware that Measure B in Santa Clara County has been approved and allocated roughly $700 million to grade separations in the cities of Palo Alto, Mountain View, and Sunnyvale. And while that allocation has been established by voter approval, there has not been a specific plan as to how the dollars will be allocated or the timing in which those dollars would be allocated. This is an ongoing discussion at VTA, the Valley Transportation Authority, but that said, it is not assured because, as with everything on multi-year programs, we need to move as quickly as we can to lock in the decisions there. So, with $700 million overall. It's not per city. There's overall allocation to that program. So let me give you a quick walkthrough on, again, why those of us who are working on this and looking at this issue are feeling this sense of urgency. And I had a elected official tell me many years ago, you engineers, you don't think in terms of years, you think in terms of generations. And unfortunately, that can seem the case when you are dealing with projects that require many, many years and a fairly prescribed sequence of steps involved in order to go from an idea to construction. So let me do a quick walkthrough on that and why we have here what we think is an aggressive schedule that just gets us thinking about why we are really trying to move as quickly as we can on our initial decision making. Just simply looking at year 2018, with an aggressive schedule, we're showing here a completion of 2028. So it will be a decade of work, even on an aggressive schedule. So to give you a quick sense of some of the key steps involved, we're now looking at bringing in a new team as we move into this new phase of consulting support that will help us get through the alternatives analysis and the environmental work ahead. That here, by the end of the month of June, we're looking at having this 4 to 8 alternatives to evaluate in detail, and then by the end of this calendar year, this preferred alternative. That will simply allow us to proceed with a draft environmental impact report, the environmental review process being very important for many projects, many decisions that are to be made by government, but specifically as it relates to grade separations, environmental review is a key process. And that in and of itself is expected to take effectively the year 2019. So next year would be entirely consumed with an environmental process. Then proceeding in the following year, and these don't necessarily need to follow this specific sequence, but they basically give you an outline of the work ahead, approving agreements with agencies such as Caltrain, such as the Valley Transportation Authority, as has been described, as well as with agencies that will have jurisdiction, potentially Santa Clara Valley Water District, responsible for flood control, water supply, and issues that could be involved, certainly in terms of habitat as well as wetlands or our water channels. Getting through the design process itself, both preliminary and final design, in order to have documents that can actually be built, working with the engineering company, engineering design companies, and then ultimately to be able to turn it over to construction companies. In 2021, we're showing with a question mark, acquire properties. Should there be property acquisition, and it could be from actual acquisition of properties that may be near the rail line to even easements or temporary construction easements that would be needed in order to do the activity of construction, even if after construction properties can be basically restored to the state that they are today. There are easements or there may be rights that the city would need to acquire along the way. And then finally, to get the approvals involving both follow-on to environmental mitigation, should that be necessary, as well as any other approvals and roles and responsibilities necessary that would then kick off what would likely be a roughly 5-year construction period. And again, this is an aggressive schedule, recognizing on its face it could seem like, and it is, a very long time. So then turning back to the immediate issue that we've got, our trenching and tunneling white paper, this is a step in that decision-making process in our march through the year 2018 in order to help the City Council ultimately make decisions on a narrowed set and then a final set of a preferred alternative. This evening, on the 6th of March, here we are with our community roundtable. We've already had an initial discussion of the white paper with the City Council's rail Committee back a couple of weeks ago, and also a discussion with other agencies that would be involved with some of the approvals as well as their own perspectives on both from a construction and operation and property perspective, what would be important part of our understanding going forward. We expect that later this month we'll go back to the City Council's Rail Committee for a follow-on discussion, somewhat of the trench tunnel white paper, but also a discussion of a broader set of the 40 ideas and some preliminary evaluation based on staff's review of those 40 ideas that can take this trench and tunnel concept in the context of other ideas that have been developed through the community outreach process as well as the professional work to date. And then next step, in April, we've got pegged tentative dates for our rail committee to also have additional discussion of the alternatives, the ideas that have come up, and potentially taking some things off the table if by that time it's clear that whether it be from technical or from community perspectives that there are some ideas that are simply not appropriate to continue through the evaluation. And then in May to have our rail committee make its recommendation that would be heard by the full city council in June on what options would be brought forward for more detailed analysis. Now turning to the trench and tunneling white paper, again, I'll walk through this quickly. There are a number of assumptions that our consultant, Mott McDonald, used in order to develop this paper that gives us some good baseline information, including Caltrain electrification. The no passing track effectively means that the right-of-way, the width of the railroad rights-of-way, would effectively be what it is today. So there wouldn't be acquisition necessary there other than what we'll talk about in terms of construction. And that some of the railroad during construction period, the roadways would need to be built around in order to accomplish the construction activity, and that we'll talk a bit about this temporary railroad tracks located along the Alma corridor. I'll ask to hold questions unless just really burning and need to be answered in order to keep going forward. I will answer that as a part of the upcoming slides. Thank you. This is impossible to read, but it is in the white paper. It speaks to some of the constraints, the distances between some of the key crossings, as well as what would be necessary in terms of relative depth for a trench or tunnel. Effectively, just to give you a tabulation of some of the key constraints, but what that leads to is what's shown here as a profile. And so this is an engineering drawing. If you could look along the Caltrain right-of-way from the north end of town to the south end of town at San Antonio. Here is San Francisco Creek on the left, San Antonio on the right, showing effectively, if you could cut across the land itself, we've got a vertical scale that's exaggerated, showing via a dotted line effectively the type of the elevation at which a tunnel or a trench would be dug in order to clear many of the key constraints around the San Francisco Creek, existing Oregon Expressway, and the like. And there are a number of alternatives that the white paper looks at, whether it be a citywide trench or tunnel to one that is focused specifically on South Palo Alto with a couple of variations. The question was, would Alma Street be affected during construction? This is a key point, so let me spend a minute here. It's what's known as a shoe fly, a track, where the existing, let's see, if this is looking north, that, let's say if this were Alma Street here on the right of this drawing, you're looking to the north, effectively what you're seeing here, and that the railroad, the Caltrain right-of-way is here with the tracks as located on my little laser pointer. And in order to dig a trench below where the existing tracks are, there would need to be a temporarily relocated Caltrain line, basically running where both the landscaping as well as, in all likelihood, the southbound lanes of Alma Street itself would be taken up by this temporary shoe fly track, as it's referred to. A key assumption here is, as you see, there's overhead power lines because by the time we're ready to go to construction on the grade separations, Caltrain will be electrified, and so that needs to be accounted for into the space as well as the construction method used for that. And again, this applies for any of the citywide trench options where there's digging that requires a relocation of the track itself in order to remain in operations during the construction period. And again, that would require the removal of the landscaping as well as affecting the operation of Alma Street. Also, and Mark can describe this in a little more detail, the photo here is of the Alameda Corridor project. This runs between the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles to the downtown rail yards in the LA region. Mark and I actually worked together in the city of Long Beach, so we have some history in somewhat dealing with the interface between the city needs and in the case of the city of Long Beach, where we worked the Metro Blue Line. So we were involved in both operationally as well as dealing with some of the improvements along that line. Notable here from this photo that because of the walls, which in many cases can be fairly substantial walls, there's a need to keep them braced and to ensure that the walls themselves don't cave in, which is the reason for these overhead beams in the case of the Alameda Corridor, or as Mark will describe, the alternative is to use tiebacks that would be rods that go into the go under adjacent properties while keeping the overhead clear. The alternative shown here, where there's not the overhead beams, but instead it's clear span. And again, this is the Alameda Corridor project in Los Angeles, going from the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles in the foreground to in the distance downtown Los Angeles. A few of the issues, in addition to what was noted for any of the alternatives that involve an open cut trench, particularly those for the citywide length, that there's right-of-way impacts necessary in order to build the shoe fly potentially. There's definitely the need to relocate and in some cases strengthen the utilities. There are underground utilities in Alma Street which were built or placed in a way to be fine when there are cars and trucks in some cases traveling on them, but trains are a bit heavier. And so as a result, need reinforcement of the existing utilities, both at crossings as well as under Alma Street itself. There are, as noted, the vertical limitations of the streets, the transportations that cross, as well as the creeks. And there's always the issues of construction. And then there are opportunities in terms of the relative costs, and we'll speak to that in a minute, and that with a trench, opportunities for more crossings. I'm going more quickly at this point. We do, in the white paper, talk about the covered trench, where instead of simply leaving it open up above, there could be backfill that would allow uses up above a trench. As it happens, that is actually the highest cost of the options that were evaluated. There would be the need, since they're not open, there would be a need for ventilation facilities as well as public safety, access, egress necessary for a covered trench, as well as some of the same issues of construction and relocation necessary for utilities, while potentially providing opportunities for new uses in that cover. And finally, we looked at the scenario of a bored tunnel. Tunnel boring machine shown here, in which this is effectively the machinery, the type of machinery that would be used to bore a tunnel. Here's something of a profile where if you had a tunnel boring machine that in this scenario used two bores that would be used to excavate a tunnel that in some cases may be able to go deeper. Some of the issues there, that the right-of-way impacts would be limited, for a shoe fly would be limited to the locations, the portals, where a tunnel boring machine is placed to go down and then to come back up on either end, as well as wherever it's necessary for station excavation and the like. Some of the utility issues may be a little different, though, again, we've got construction issues. relative to the cut and cover trench, it's actually estimated at a slightly lower cost, although still in the billions. And again, having opportunities for uses up above. Just quickly noting, here's a photo of an entrance portal for a tunnel boring machine. As you see, it's not a simple mechanical issue or mechanical piece of equipment to be placed with a number of issues. Again, we can speak to in a little more detail should there be questions. One note of particular interest we know here in Palo Alto is our groundwater, our shallow aquifer that has been encountered when excavating basements and the like. We have some information that was put together by our Public Works Department that shows, relatively speaking, the depth to water. As we know, we have a shallow aquifer, and in some cases, if we were to look at the depth of tunneling or even trenching that would be necessary relative to the depth of the groundwater, that in many of the, or all of the key locations where we have our existing crossings at University, Churchill, Oregon, that the trench would actually be deeper, 50 feet deep versus 32 feet deep to the aquifer itself. So there would be the necessity of water protection during construction, as well as both pumping and waterproofing systems being necessary in order to keep that operational. And as we know locally at Oregon Expressway, the need to keep it maintained and can be an ongoing issue. Here on order of magnitude costs, also part of the working paper, and also had been referenced in a companion document on financing that had been prepared by our consultant team, ranging from the open trench of $2.4 to $2.9 billion, again, order of magnitude here, to the twin board tunnel at 2.8 to 3.4 billions. Again, all of the citywide trench and tunnel options being in this order of magnitude of between $2.5 and $4 billion as an order of magnitude estimate. We would note here that the BART project extension through San Jose is most recent estimate of $4.7 billion in terms of a length, not entirely unlike what we're considering here. And so as an order of magnitude does somewhat affirm this is the general order of magnitude that we should be looking at. The open trench 2A and 2B focusing only on the South Palo Alto legs. So with that, to venture some observations from staff that, as they say among engineers, anything's possible. And at the same time, while technically feasible, we would note that there are a number of caveats that would come along. One is that Caltrain and Union Pacific use a 1% maximum grade as a standard, and it would be necessary for us to get an exception to that standard to 2% approval that would involve some process and some time, but nonetheless is essential in order to make that these scenarios possible. That the issues around construction impacts and a number of operational as well as maintenance issues would require cooperation both from adjacent cities as well as some of the agencies that I mentioned earlier, and that we would expect that these costs that would be required on an ongoing basis would also need to be addressed. So with that, the staff conclusion is that the citywide options may likely be cost prohibitive, while at the same time leaving the door open to the subsurface options in South Palo Alto that have been presented. So with that, let's see, we're going to need to switch the presentation. So let me do that to allow Mark to get ready.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And we'll just take a minute here because I know we have additional members of the public that have not able to find a seat. There's more people than we expected, so we're going to bring some additional chairs to the front here. There's already 3 chairs if people want to come forward to find a seat. And for the roundtable discussion for the second half of the meeting, we're going to bring some tables up on the stage here so that we can have some additional roundtables. So come on down. Yes.
Can we speak to that in general?
Yes, it's a great question. When we get to Q&A, we'll certainly address that. There's still some more seats here for folks. Also want to recognize a couple of council members are here. I saw Councilmember Karen Holman here, and Councilmember Lydia Koo I saw here, and Councilmember Corey Walbach, who's also the chair of the Rail Committee. So you might have a chance to meet some of the council members this evening. So with
help with
that, Ed,
trying to figure out how to get this to do a full page. Anybody here work with? Let's see if that works. Maybe. It may be the best we can do. Ooh, that's not great. All right. Well, we'll work with that. There you go.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good.
I don't think we're in a
Can you hear me now? No?
Put on your tie.
Is there volume on it? Is that
I'll
working
take
better?
the moment to
Can you hear
reintroduce.
me in the back now? No, still not.
Test, test.
Test. Better? Can you hear me now? Okay. I sound like a commercial, don't I? Just for you latecomers, again, I'll introduce myself. My name is Mark Christoffels. I am Chief Engineer and an executive with the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments. And as part of that, we created a subsidiary to build a project known as the Alameda Corridor East. The San Gabriel Valley consists of 31 cities, approximately 2 million people. We're basically the eastern part of Los Angeles County. The 31 cities joined together to take on a consortium of projects and formed what's known in California as the Joint Powers Authority. One of the projects that they took on is what I'm going to describe today. And we'll see if this works. There we go. So I want to put it a little bit into context of where we're located. First, the explanation for the Alameda name. We all know that there's an Alameda County up here. There is a very large street in LA known as Alameda Street, and the rail corridor parallels Alameda Street. So we sort of adopted in Los Angeles what is known as the Alameda Rail Corridor, and we are the easterly extension. What you see on the left-hand side are the two major ports in the entire United States. 40% of the goods in the entire U.S. go in and out of these two ports, primarily by rail. And from there, what they do is they travel up a corridor going to near downtown Los Angeles, where there is a very, very large rail yard. Goods that aren't consumed locally are then retransferred onto freight lines and then go east. And what you see on this diagram is a blue line, which is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, kind of goes southerly through Orange County and then back up through Riverside and San Bernardino. The red lines are the Union Pacific Railroad, and they primarily go through eastern LA County. The green area that you see highlighted there is the San Gabriel Valley. That's the 31 cities I was referring to, approximately a population of 2 million people. What we knew is that the rail activity coming out of this port was going to increase dramatically. In the late 1990s, these cities conducted a study. They were already seeing a lot of gate downtime, the type of thing that you're experiencing in this community, and long waits. And what they knew is these trains were going to get longer and more frequent. Sound familiar? And so what they did is they conducted a study and said, well, what are we going to do about it? And out of that came a long-range plan to do physical grade separations. There were a multitude of projects that were constructed. Some were simple individual grade separations, road over or road under. There were two in the LA that ended up being trenches very similar to what you're considering. One is the Alameda Corridor, which literally is that green line. And Ed had showed you photographs, and that was a sunken corridor where the freight trains were going. That is actually a revenue corridor. So the two major railroads that travel through that actually pay a fee to run their trains through that corridor. So they were able to get, in essence, almost $1 billion revenue loan, and they constructed that project, and they're now paying it back vis-a-vis the fees. It's for every rail car that goes through there, there's a fee associated with it. As you go east from Los Angeles, we ended up with 19 individual crossings that we felt needed to be dealt with. How did we make that decision? Because there's 52 of them within that region. We looked at vehicle count, vehicle delay, safety aspects. Obviously, if you've got a crossing with only 3,000 cars a day, which is almost nothing, you're not going to spend $40, $50, $60 million to do a grade separation. But if I've got a crossing that has 45,000 cars a day, it's definitely worth our while to do that. And this is what was anticipated by those elected officials back in the late 1990s. What you could see on the left, of course, are the long queues. What we see on the right, and we actually experienced that, what happens with a long queue, it's sort of that frustration you get when you sit at a traffic signal and you inch up and then it turns red, and you inch up and it turns red, and then when it finally turns green, you go, to hell with it, I'm going to go through this light no matter what it takes because I've waited 2 or 3 cycles. You get that motor desperation, I call it. We were starting to see that with the grade crossings, and we were seeing motorists taking chances because they were tired of these gates coming down and actually driving around the gates with unfortunate circumstances you see here. And then, of course, the crossing with the kids, which I know you guys have in this community as well. And you can see there's the projection. We were going to double our particular corridor from 67 trains to 127 trains coming through. And what that doesn't say is the length of the trains as well. From approximately half a mile long to approximately a mile long trains were going to come through that corridor. Let's see. This is the corridor itself. It shows all 52 crossings. It's currently a status sheet of where we are. So what you'll see in green, the little green triangles, we built safety improvements. For those crossings that weren't necessarily going to be grade separated, what we did is we enhanced the signage. We actually did something what's called quad gates. Where those crossings where motorists were actually driving around the gates, we put in gates on the exit side as well. So it literally locked in the entire crossing and kept motorists from driving around. We've also installed pedestrian safety gates. That's becoming more common so that even the pedestrian is being locked out of the corridor. That's what all the green was. This color here, the sort of red star, these are the grade separations we've actually completed to date. The ones that you see in yellow are the ones currently under construction, and the ones in red are in design. And we believe this entire program, which is estimated now at $1.7 billion, should be completed in about 5 years. And again, we started in the year 2000, so we've been at it for quite a while. This is the funding, and this is where it all came from. So you can see the state funding primarily came from Proposition 1B. It was a few governors ago, and we as citizens voted for a big infrastructure bond measure here in California. The other left green side is similar to what you have here. It's a regional transportation sales tax that is issued in Los Angeles County. And then the federal money you see of $244 million. The rest of it are miscellaneous contributions either by railroad or local entities. These are the different types of way we dealt with the crossings. So what you see on the upper left is what you guys are contemplating, which is lowering the train into the ground. What you see on the lower left was probably our most common method, and that was actually taking a road and sinking it underneath the tracks. What you see on the right is the safety improvement. It's actually showing the 4 gates. And then what you see on the upper right is an actual elevation of the tracks. We had 2 locations where we actually took the trains and we elevated them above the roadway network. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about our project, which is in the city of San Gabriel. We would evaluate all 4 of those alternatives every time we would go in. Economics plays a big part of it, obviously. In this case, we could not lower or raise roadways because what you see here, right here, and it's shown up there in that little dot, that is the historic San Gabriel Mission, and it sits about 150 feet from the railroad tracks. And there was no way for me to adjust roads and protect the integrity of this. Also, visually, we couldn't lift the tracks because you would be visually taking away something from the historic monument. So the only thing we had in this case was to lower the railroad into the ground, and that's why we went forward with it. This is the corridor as it existed. One of the things you have when you're dealing with, in this case, Union Pacific Railroad, is they have an asset. It is their railroad right-of-way. They own it. And if you're going to do something to that asset, you have to make them whole. They made the point that even though they only had 1 set of tracks currently, they could in the future run 3 sets of track. So whatever I did to their facility, I had to make sure that they had 3 sets of track or the capability of installing 3 sets of track in the future. So currently there was only 1 track there. So what was nice for us is that, as Ed indicated, you guys are going to have to construct a shoe fly. I cannot tell Union Pacific Railroad, hey, just stop operations for 5 years and we can build this thing and then you can bring your trains back. You can imagine what that would do to their commerce and their revenue stream. So they needed a set of tracks to duplicate what they had currently, and that was 1 set of tracks. And what we're able to do here is within that 100-foot right-of-way, we were able to build a trench that would accommodate 3 sets of trains and keep a temporary set of tracks adjacent to it. What that meant for us is we didn't have to do what you did or what you might do, which is actually building a temporary set of tracks on an adjacent roadway. So this would have been the ultimate solution, and they were happy with that. This is the corridor. It's approximately 2 miles long. It shows you where we began on the western side and where we terminated in the city of Rosemead on the eastern side. And this gives you some stats about it. The project cost for us was $312 million. That includes the design, construction, and we did have right-of-way acquisition. We did have to acquire a few parcels as part of it. You can see that we had shoe fly construction. We had 2 drainage channels that we had to modify. Ed mentioned that you have some as well. We had 2 that also crossed. And then, of course, the utilities. If you're going to dig into the ground, you're going to hit utilities. You're going to have to relocate them, and there's a pretty significant cost associated with that. So how was ours actually built? It's built from the ground down. What you do is you first drill these large 5-foot diameter holes, and then you fill them with concrete. So what we did is we drilled a 5-foot hole, and then we filled it with concrete. And we did that one after another, after another, after another. You're literally creating a wall in the ground. So we did that on one side, and then we did it on the other. And what you see up here is a photograph. What you do is you drill a hole, you put in the steel reinforcement bars, and then you fill it up with concrete. And then you start excavating. So now, in essence, I have a wall here and a wall there. I can actually dig down between the 2 that I've created. And you can see here as they're coming down. Now, we mentioned, if you're going to take away the soil, what keeps the wall from falling over? One method was with the photographs that Ed had showed you. You saw the braces running across the top. Union Pacific Railroad indicated to us they would not have a facility. They would not own a facility with that. And one of the reasons why is if they have a derailment, they needed to be able to put in a crane and grab those cars and fix them. And if you've got those cross beams, it makes it awfully difficult for them to do that. So they asked, or they demanded actually, that we have it open. So what we had to do is we have these steel rods that go from here underneath the ground, and they actually hold up the walls. 90% of our acquisition of right-of-way was securing the underground rights to put in these steel rods, because this land on either side was privately owned, and we had to put in these steel rods. They did not have any effect on what was there in the buildings, but you know, if you own the property, you own the rights underneath it as well, and we had to acquire those. This gives you an idea of what that construction actually looks like. And what you see on the metal bars, that's actually a temporary brace for the walls. Here you can see the kind of rough look as they're excavating down of those 5-foot piles sitting one after another. A lot of truck activity will occur. I'm going to be totally honest with you. When you're moving that much dirt, you're talking truck after truck after truck after truck for quite a while. And what we ended up agreeing with the communities is that we would rehabilitate, which we are now doing, all of the roads that we damaged because of the heavy truck material that was going out. This gives you an idea as they're pouring the concrete, the reinforcement bars. Again, it actually shows you the rough kind of columns that were constructed. And then you finish them off. You pour a smooth wall to hide the columns. This is actually more decorative than structural, but it will protect the walls from water and other environmental concerns. So some of our challenges, just to share with you, obviously funding was an issue. We went after every grant fund we could secure. We lobbied heavily both in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. We didn't have no other revenue source, so we were just going after whatever was available. Property acquisition, I'll be honest with you, some of them we had to go through eminent domain, court proceedings to acquire those. Utility relocations, coordinating with the multitude of utilities that we have in the area, it took a while to work those out. In our case, working out agreements with Union Pacific Railroad. They are a huge company, very bureaucratic, and it took a while to get all those agreements in place. We, as an agency, needed to acquire a liability insurance for the construction of this project. Ownership and maintenance. We are an agency that's building it, but we're not going to own this thing. Most of it gets turned over to the railroad. Some of it gets turned over to the local jurisdictions. Utilities obviously end up with the respective utility, the sewer, water, et cetera. As I indicated, haul route impacts. Street closures. What we did is we did this one at a time. We promised the community that we would only close one street and build the bridge and other appurtenances, and until that was functional, then we would go to the next one and go to the next one. That kept the community circulating. I will tell you it added about 12 to 14 months to the overall construction timeline because you have to kind of stage it as you're going along, whereas the contractor, if he had his desires, would have just done the whole thing all in one fell swoop. We did mitigate, and then, of course, public outreach is a big one. We spent a considerable amount of time. I had 2 individuals working full-time on doing nothing but community outreach and public outreach to the businesses. The right-of-way, as I indicated, we had 62 property interests, 1 full take, and then temporary construction, easements, and the tiebacks that we were talking about. This was the overall cost and how it breaks down. So the construction was $174 million. You can see the construction management, which the CM is over there. That's $40 million. Right-of-way acquisition, $23 million. Railroad cost, what we paid to the railroad, it was their track crews that installed the track, for example. It's their crews that removed the old railroad crossings. It was their crew that was involved in a good deal of the construction activity. Program management is the oversight of it all. Third party, that would have been things like Los Angeles County Flood Control District, that type of thing. And then our design costs approximately $30 million. And this was how it was paid for. So the state paid for $237 of that million. Federal Highway Administration contributed $14 million. Measure R, which is our sales tax initiative, contributed $54 million, and then there was local contributions of about $5 million. Some of the things that I shared primarily with the city staff and the rail committee, not necessarily maybe that would get involved here with you looking at the project, but these things take a while to work out. There's a lot of agreements, you guys, that have to get put in place before you actually move the first bucket of dirt. And that's why, as Ed was saying, these things don't happen immediately. You go through an extensive design process, an environmental process, agreements, getting your funding all worked out. It just doesn't happen overnight. And this gives you an idea of the number of agreements that we had on the project. CEQA, NEPA, we had to do the same thing. We had to go through environmental clearance. It took us also about as long as Ed was showing in your timeline for us to get environmental clearance. For us, it was a little more difficult because we had major cultural resources next to a historic mission. One of the things we had to do, you might find of interest, is we pre-excavated 5 feet down with archaeologists before we started our major construction work. We removed over 5,000 artifacts, bone remnants, that type of thing. Most of it went to UCLA to be cataloged. It all dated back to the Indians that were living in the area as well as those that inhabited the mission itself. That by itself took over a year. Fortunately, or hopefully, you don't have that same issue, but it was a big deal for us. And then what we did is we had a monitoring program. We obviously, during the environmental process, made promises to the community, for example, dust control, that we would control that. And we had a monitoring program to make sure all of those mitigations that we promised were actually in place. And here's some of the things that we did in order to make that happen. And here are some of the sample mitigations, noise and dust control, that sort of thing. And here again, some more. We actually had to put up noise walls when we were in close proximity to residents in the area. And then this is the archaeological excavation as it was occurring. Literally, you guys, as you remember it, you know, with the little shakers and pulling out little artifacts. And then the other thing we did, we had a lot of businesses in the area that we knew were going to be affected by it, especially the street closures. We did an extensive outreach program to them to make sure that we didn't lose any of these very important businesses in the community. It will be difficult at times for them. Obviously, if it's not easy to get to the business, they tend to lose customers. We want to make sure they didn't go out of business, that they were made whole, and we worked very, very hard on that. And then here's an idea of the different type of businesses that we were working with, and a support program that we had as well. And then outreach. If you guys do get that far, you will probably get notices like we were creating, almost on a biweekly basis, informing you of what's going to happen, which construction is occurring, and where it's happening. And then in our area, we do have a large Asian population, so we had to translate a lot of those documents for that community. And this is sort of a sample of the notice, and the construction outreach, and the outline. And then there's our website. And so that's kind of very brief synopsis of what we went through, and I think I'm turning it over to your city manager at this point. I think he's going to do the questions. Yeah.
Let's get Michael. Okay, so the group has it.
I don't know who does that.
So we're actually right on schedule. I'm Jim Keene, city manager here in Palo Alto, and we set aside 15 minutes for some questions before we break into the tables, sitting around the tables. I see we have some people at the back, so as we get near the end of this, this portion, we're actually going to be moving some tape. We're already doing it almost right now. We'll move 3 or 4 more tables and chairs up here, so those of you who are in the back will have the chance to sit around tables. We have just a short period of time here, and this session has been designed to brief a lot of folks in this first hour on the basics and the mechanics of the trench or tunneling or citywide option. And the idea of being able to sit around these tables is we'll guide you through a series of other kind of questions where you'll have the chance, the opportunity to speak more about that with yourselves, the ability to write on these tables, both questions and comments that you have. It's the fastest way that we could crowdsource a lot of input from the community that we can then also use with the City Council Rail Committee. I think Rob, you and Ed will be sure that the PowerPoints and the presentations we have, we can share how those will be accessible. So 2 things. One, I would ask that we ask some questions right now that would be in the interest of sort of educating the whole group here rather than necessarily your own personal question or issue. You'll have the chance to do that at the table. Secondly, if you would please refrain from disguising a comment in the form of a question. We really wanted to use this as an opportunity to, again, hear from the folks who are making the presentation, answer some questions that are curious. Finally, again, just remember that when we get to this end of the session, we hope to have a lot of comments and questions, some here, some that you all have shared, and we'll talk about how we'll keep you posted as we go forward. So why don't we start right here, and I'll just sort of, yes.
Sure, I'll go first. So 2 real quick questions. One, I was hoping to hear a tunnel presentation, which this was all about trench, and so the question is why no tunnel presentation? And the second is, along with tunnel, why we're not seeing a joint city effort like Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Atherton come together to work on a tunnel together?
Okay, well, good questions. I mean, we brought the expert that we had up here on the trenching piece of this. Ed, did you want to say anything about tunneling? I mean, we have some of the basic data on tunneling, and I think that's the issue, and we would love to hear comments that you all have. We are talking with other jurisdictions. It's in different stages. Obviously, it's a complicated project, right, because we've got at least 3 counties involved, lots of different cities, different agencies. We've started some preliminary kind of conversations if there's a trench or tunnel issue with Menlo Park and our adjacent neighbors. Somebody asked an earlier question here, what are other folks doing? For the most part, and I could be corrected by somebody else here, we don't really know of any other jurisdictions say that are having as serious a conversation as we are about a trenching or tunneling alternative throughout their whole jurisdiction. So that is a difference between us. Yes. Okay, sorry.
A couple quick questions. One is, it looks like our project would cost 10 times as much as theirs, and so why is that for a similar scope? And then the other question is, I feel like I'm late in the game, why aren't we talking about the other options that are done further north on the peninsula? Has that somehow already been ruled out, where there's an elevated grade?
Okay, so great question. I don't think it was 10, I thought it was $1.6 billion up there. Is that what you were talking about? Our project estimates are $3 to $4 billion depending on, so let's just say that's sort of twice as much. The alternatives, no, the total project was $1.6
Yeah.
billion.
Let me add.
Anyway.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
First, let's talk about the tunneling. There are really only, at least that I'm aware of heavy rail. You guys were not talking about light rail, which is obviously like in our area the Blue Line or what you guys have up here. Heavy rail, there is no real tunnel activity that has occurred. There are 3 large sections of rail that have been lowered. The 2 that I showed you here, and then Reno is the other one. If you ever go to downtown Reno, you will see that they built a similar trench to get their trains through that community as well. All 3 were done as open channels, if you want to call it, open trenches. All 3 had to be done that way because of rail accessibility. They need to be able to get in and get these things out of there. The difference between a heavy rail and a light rail, if a light rail gets disconnected somehow, they can actually go in the tunnel and pull these things out. You're not going to do that with a heavy locomotive. You really need to be able to get in there and grab these things and pull them out. So while a tunneling option is something to look at, it's very expensive for one thing. The other is you're going to find maybe with Caltrain or in our case BNSF or Union Pacific Railroad, they're just not going to go for it because it's from an operational standpoint. In terms of cost, you have to realize we bid our project just after the recession. So one, we got lucky. We were bidding this job when contractors were really hungry. And then our shoe fly portion is much easier to construct. We were able to build that shoe fly literally next to the existing rail lines. You're having to do that literally as it was described on a road adjacent, and you're having to electrify it. We didn't have to do that. So that kept our costs down significantly in terms of it. And then one other thing is you are having to go much deeper than we did because of your stream beds. Because of the topography, we're actually located adjacent to the San Gabriel Mountains. Our topography is very steep there. You're kind of flat. And so we were able to literally reroute the streams and not have to sink this thing so far in the ground. Our rail tracks do not go underneath the stream beds. They don't. The stream beds, we were able to get them to go underneath the lowered railway. It saved us hundreds of millions of dollars in costs. So your circumstances as well as the timing and the construction I think are leading to the cost differential that you're seeing.
Plus our project's going entirely, essentially almost through, completely through residential areas. But real quickly, he had one other question. Why are we only talking about trenching and tunneling tonight? That's because we're only talking about trenching and tunneling tonight. That is not because that's the only option. The city's actually going to have other sessions, and we'll continue to have those discussions about other alternatives that are out there. That's part of this process of moving from 40 to 4 to 8 to 1. Okay, I'm going to get somebody, Arthur, who typically doesn't ask the question right here.
Okay, so 2 quick questions. First, have some more detail about traffic impact mitigations because of the partial closure of Alma Street. That's question 1. Question 2 is, does it really make sense for Caltrain to construct an electrification infrastructure only to have us come along a couple of years later and tear all that up and replace it?
Did you want to speak to that, Ed, or is Josh here on the congestion? Did you want to speak to that?
So, as we move forward, I'm Josh Mello, the Chief Transportation Official for the city. As we move forward with, the analysis of any alternatives that we decide to move forward this summer, there'll be a very detailed traffic analysis that'll be done both on the construction, if there's a necessary detour due to construction because of a shoe fly track or any other construction impacts, that'll be accounted for, as well as long-term traffic effects if we're modifying any roadways or making any other changes to the road network. But we have not done any analysis yet of, exactly what the impacts of a shoe fly would be on Alma Street.
Very back.
Okay, we got a couple more minutes, that's it, and then we want to be sure we really break into the round tables. Were you going up there to get the mic yourself, Arthur? Was that what you were doing? Hold on a second. I will. Let's do this guy.
I'm not sure whether this is accurate, but certainly in some of the online discussion about the study, there was some points made that there was no analysis of value being given to development or partial development above what would be undergrounding of the rail. So can you talk to that point, whether any of that was done, any of that kind of analysis to reduce the cost in that
Yeah,
manner?
so this question really relates to this concept of, is there some way to actually capture the value of the right-of-way if it were underground at the 4-mile section or whatever, or the section that we have through our town, and capture that in some way? That obviously would mean selling that to development in some way. There's been some discussion about what kind of scale of development that would actually have to take place to be able to raise enough money. So as part of looking at the different financing alternatives, the white paper that's been prepared on that, and we have access to that on the website also, has identified the implications of that. I just would say one thing for you to think about: the financing piece. Even if the community were willing to accept the level of development that might have to be necessary to capture enough value to fund these projects, the kind of cash flow issue of being able to borrow against available funding over time in order to be able to then construct prospectively a big projects. In many ways, the biggest infrastructure of the project the city's really faced generations, really. That's quite challenging to think about how you actually time cash flow with the needs that we would have to be able to fund something. Because that's something we'll be talking about in more detail with the Rail Committee and spitting that back out. So, Arthur, I'm going to let you ask the last question, and then we'll break into the small groups.
I appreciate that. Since the gentleman from ACE is here, and you have experiences with things other than, in addition to tunnel and trenching, you said had some things about underpasses of roads. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of experience with that, and in particular about the closure of the roads, and if there are any parallel roads and you have to close both of them. And I'm wondering that kind of phenomenon.
Sure. So for us, a typical underpass would take about 36 months to construct, and we would literally close access to that road because you are excavating down. Joining roads, we handled it in many different ways. In some cases, you have the same thing here. We would have a road that actually paralleled the track. So what happens is you end up going underneath both of them, right? The railroad track and the parallel road. And then we would have to construct what's known as a connector road or connector ramp, sort of like a freeway ramp that would bring you back up to it. Unfortunately, that sort of thing consumes a tremendous amount of real estate. And as we know, in California, real estate drives most of our projects because of the cost. The other thing that happens when you sink an underpass is anybody who had a driveway adjacent to that is now landlocked. Because if they had a driveway in close proximity to the railroad track and now that road is about 30, 40 feet down, that driveway is so far up, that land is no longer accessible and it becomes an acquisition. I would say for us on a typical underpass project, I'm currently building one. Total price tag is $95 million. Construction cost is $42 million. We spent almost $32 million on top of that for real estate acquisition. The underpass causes and wreaks havoc sometimes with the adjoining properties. So you have to keep that in mind too. It's a balancing act.
Okay, I'm going to turn this back over to Rob, who's going to help facilitate and get us all organizing, getting into the rectangle tables discussion.
Okay, thanks for the presentations, gentlemen. That was terrific, very informative and great questions. What we want to do now is take a little time for you to talk together about this very important issue. We have a number of questions on the back of the agenda, and I'll walk through those as we have this last hour session here. What I would ask is the people in the back and those that don't have a seat to please come forward and join us on the stage here. We want to fill up these tables here with neighbors so that you can talk to one another. As Jim said earlier, one of the things that we want you to do is not only talk and listen to one another, but then write down your ideas and questions about where you think we should go from here. You can write right on the table sheets or on the post-it notes. So we'll give it a couple of minutes to get everybody settled before we begin. But again, for those in the back, please come up and join us on the stage. We probably have 30 chairs up here. Find a space next to a neighbor. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I could get your attention one more time. This is the last time, so let me just first thank you all for being here and being so gracious with your time. And I know it was very busy and it was crowded, but you stuck with us. And we just want to thank you very much for that. We know this is a very important decision and we can't make it without as much community input as possible. We're going to capture all of the information that we both heard and that you are leaving with us on the tables, and we will summarize what we heard and include it in our FAQs that are on the website. I also want to share with you that the Rail Committee, the Council Rail Committee, which is 4 council members, they meet at least monthly. The next meeting is on March 21st at City Hall. It's at 8 o'clock in the morning. We encourage you to visit and share your thoughts with the Rail Committee. There'll be more public outreach like this, so please stay in touch and give us I hope you all signed in and gave us your email so we can stay in touch with you. With that, as you wrap up in the last few minutes, the last question is, how can we better engage the community in this topic? We're hearing from a lot of people, but we'd like to hear from even more. So what do you think we could do that would engage even more neighbors, people of different ages, folks of different cultures? This is one of the biggest decisions that the city has before us, and we need your help, and we need to connect with as many people as possible. So with that, I want to thank you all very much, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you.